Hi, good afternoon, everyone. You are very welcome to today's webinar, Sustainability Trends for Business 2026, which is our first webinar this year. My name is Kathleen O'Regan, and I'm a Senior Executive in the Sustainability Solutions team in Enterprise Ireland. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording and the slides afterwards. The recording will also be available to watch back on the Enterprise Ireland website. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so if you have any questions during the webinar, please pop them into the chat and hopefully we'll be able to answer them at the end. So this year's webinar series covers a range of sustainability topics, including voluntary sustainability reporting for SMEs, strategies for responsible and transparent sustainability communications, managing climate risk for your business, and green finance. And while this webinar will touch on some of these topics, we will be going into them in more detail. So with increasing global uncertainty and shifting regulatory landscapes, as well as organisations facing accelerated climate and biodiversity risks, integrating sustainability into core business strategy is now essential for staying competitive and resilient, particularly in the face of rising energy and raw material costs, and also increased customer and supply chain demands. Companies that act now are well positioned to differentiate their offerings, strengthen their market position, and unlock new commercial opportunities, turning those potential risks into opportunities. So we're delighted to host today's webinar in collaboration with BDO Ireland. And for today's webinar, I am joined by Mark Aboud, Katie Lynch, Jennifer O'Connor, and sorry, now my slides aren't moving, and Carol Lynch of BDO Ireland. So Katie is a senior sustainability consultant and specialises in sustainability reporting, double materiality assessment, gap analysis, and policy development. Mark is a partner in ESG reporting and insurance. Carl then is a partner and head of customs and international trade. And Jennifer O'Connor is a sustainability manager at BDO. So Mark, I'll hand over to you and I'll come back in at the end for Q&A. So thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kathleen, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for the introduction as well. So what I plan to do over the next couple of minutes is share an overview of some of the sustainability signals we are seeing in the sustainability space and the priorities for Irish businesses for 2026. Once we introduce the priorities, we'll focus on a couple of areas, and my colleagues will deep dive into to share a bit further context in relation to each of them. So maybe to start on the first slide and some of the signals we're seeing out in the market, and we've split this between headwinds and tailwinds. So maybe starting with some of the challenges or headwinds that we're seeing in the market. And firstly, increasing disasters are affecting supply chains, risk profiles, and insurability. And in the recent history, repairing the damage caused by the likes of Storm Chandra, as an example, could cost up to 50 million euro. Projections this year suggest a world record-breaking year for global economic losses in this space. So in terms of regulatory uncertainty, whilst there have been rollbacks in the likes of the US and simplification measures in the EU, we've seen advancements in California, the APAC regions of China, Philippines, and Japan. And although it can be challenging for organizations operating in multiple jurisdictions, and although the progress has slowed, it probably highlights that disclosure requirements are not going away and will impact the organization either as a reporter or as an organization that reports or sits within a reporter's value chain. In terms of power demands, so global data center electricity consumption is increasing, fueled by AI and electrification. In Ireland, data centers are confirmed to use approximately around a third of national grid electricity in 2026, which is sparking quite a big debate around energy security and emission targets. In terms of fossil fuel prioritization, incredibly topical at present. Prior to year end and earlier in the year, the US administration has been quite vocal and increased oil and gas production, relaxed carbon emission regulations, and withdrew from the Paris Agreement as well, the latest regime. I think these policy decisions are obviously implemented before the onset of the conflict in the Middle East. And we're seeing what the events, particularly today, over the last couple of days, the pressure this is putting on the price of fuel. And I suppose the question now is, whether these challenging geopolitical circumstances could act as a catalyst to accelerate investment in the adoption of renewable energy. Despite these headwinds, we are seeing some positive tailwinds in a number of areas. And maybe to start with net zero commitments, and over 10,000 companies globally have signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. That represents around 40% of global market capitalization. Over 100 large Irish companies have made some form of commitment, and we've started to see it come through as a part of supplier engagements in large contracts in multiple sectors. Solar is increasing in efficiency and battery costs are decreasing. Electric vehicles, as an example, now account for 25% of global car sales. In Ireland, electric vehicle sales hit a January milestone, outpacing petrol and diesel cars for the first time, and we expect that to continue over the course of the year. The voluntary carbon market is valued in the billions, and there's a growing portion of credits aligning with new, stricter international integrity standards as well. And finally, from a financial performance perspective, global sustainable finance issuance is expected to reach 1.6 trillion this year on clean energy, outperforming the market more generally. So I suppose from an Enterprise Ireland organisation perspective, understanding these signals is really important, as being able to manage the risk of ongoing headwinds, but being able to capitalise as well on the opportunities arising from some of the tailwinds in a fast-changing market is integral for your business and a key consideration. So just moving on to the next slide, and on this side, what I'm going to briefly give an overview of some market trends we expect to see in 2026. This is based on a publication we released earlier in the year. As Kathleen said, these slides and the links as well will be made available to you as well, so you'll be able to double click in to the background of each of them. But maybe to give a brief overview of some of them, and then the team are going to give some further context for a couple of them. So climate transition plans and validated science-based targets continue to be a core expectation across the EU, UK, and Ireland, driven by regulatory requirements, not only regulatory requirements, but also scrutiny from investors, lenders, and insurers. New EU laws, including CBAM, the Circular Economy Act, and the EU Deforestation Regulation, EUDR, are continuing focus on the end-to-end supply chain traceability, compliance, and data verification. Organizations are increasingly expected to broaden their sustainability strategies beyond climate to include biodiversity and nature-related considerations, supported by emerging frameworks such as the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and SBTi for Nature. Sustainability reporting frameworks continue to evolve, placing greater emphasis on ESG data quality, internal controls, and also the scrutiny of sustainability claims to manage greenwashing and regulatory risk across jurisdictions, something we'll talk a bit about later. Digital ESG solutions are playing a growing role in supporting data management, traceability, and reporting, helping organizations to respond more effectively to increasing information and compliance demands. And finally, developments in sustainable finance are influencing how organizations approach capital investment, with a growing range of options available to support sustainability and decarbonisation objectives this year. So again, something that the Enterprise Ireland team are going to talk a little bit about later are some of the funding options that are available to you from an EI perspective, which is quite interesting. Now we're gonna focus in on the areas highlighted in green over the course of the webinar, and maybe moving on to Carol Lynch, who's our customs and trade partner in the firm. And maybe just to kick off, Carol, with a question, I suppose for many organizations that are on this webinar that would import into the EU, like what should they know and how should they prepare for new EU requirements, in particular with respect to customs and trade, and elements when it comes to the likes of Scope 3, etc.
Thanks, Mark. I think for importers, what we're really seeing is a increasing connection between the import regulatory requirements to get into the EU, so to speak, and the sustainability and ESG requirements that the EU Commission is focusing on. So we're seeing, if you are importing from outside the EU, We're seeing is your suppliers or you as the importer will increasingly need to report on customs data, not just in terms of the customs data itself, but also in terms of the related sustainability data. So you could ask, why is that? Why do customs want to do that? And why are we asking the customs authorities to do it? And it's really to ensure that non-EU suppliers are put in the same position as EU suppliers and to ensure that there's a level playing field there. So typically at the moment, if you're importing into the EU, you'll be used to lodging your import declarations. You'll give information on your tariff classification, your country of origin, and your value. But now you're also being asked to add data in relation to emissions data by way of being an authorized declarant, the origin of products which are potentially from areas which are subject to deforestation. You might need to, going forward, you're going to need to provide additional tariff details on your plastic imports. There is digital passports. I know Jennifer's going to talk about that later. We've also got to comply with forced labor regulations, and again, tying back into the customs and customs and I suppose trade and US aspect of things. President Trump lodged a investigation into forced labor and also specifically called out the EU as a part of that, as one of the countries which he will be focusing on. So we can see customs moving from being solely a trade issue, and there's obviously a lot of trade issues to focus on in relation to customs at the moment, particularly in relation to the US, but also to being a legal requirement for importers to ensure they comply with sustainability requirements and sustainability data. And the EU is really using those customs import declarations as a gateway to ensure that they can capture everybody who imports into the EU under their control, and then can come back and ask you for verification of, are you complying with CBAM? Are you complying with deforestation, etc.?
Thanks, Harold. And you touched on CBAM and a couple of other requirements, but maybe focusing in on CBAM, I suppose, like, could you give us a couple of practical examples, what it means for organizations on the ground?
Yeah, so for CBAM, and this is the one that will be affecting companies mostly now, right now. If you're importing any of the in-scope products, which are there, iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizer, electricity, or hydrogen, you will have been providing transitional data for the last 2 years. But from January 26, the system went to the definitive phase of CBAM. And what you will see there is that if you're importing these in-scope items, you will have had to register as an authorized declarant with the Environmental Protection Agency. And based on the tariff codes that are associated with these products, if you aren't an authorized declarant, you physically won't be able to import into the EU. The customs authorities will pick up those tariff codes, check if you have an authorized declaration number. Is that on the import declaration? Does it match with the system? And if you're there, that's fine. You go ahead and you import. But if you're not, you will be stopped. Those goods won't be able to come into the EU. And the reason for that is to ensure that the carbon emissions from suppliers outside the EU is matched with the emissions trading scheme within the EU. So what you'll be doing is you'll be having to go back to you're basically acting as the importer. You give your registered declaration number on your import declaration. Customs now know you're in the net. And over 2026, you have to monitor, we recommend you monitor how much you're importing, because in 2027, you're going to have to report on the emissions that are in those products, and you're going to have to buy your CBAM certificates. So this is going to be a cost to you. So you need to account for that in your, in your projections for your P&L for next year. And you also, what we're saying is you need to go back to your supplier and try and verify with them, are they going to provide you with verified emissions data? Because you're going to have two choices. One is to declare based on default values, and one is to declare based on verified emissions data. But the default values are going to be set higher than the emissions data. So the EU really wants you to go back, link in with your suppliers, and obtain that verified emissions data. And it's not simply a matter of the supplier providing that information to you and saying, here's our data. It'll have to be independently verified. So the big issue here is going to be really linking back in with your suppliers and asking them how do they intend to provide you with that information. And this is kind of very similar to the same sort of process we saw in Brexit, where Irish companies had to go back to UK suppliers to get the details on what was being imported into the EU and what was likely to be the cost. And what we found at the time is that can be an incredibly difficult thing to do, because you're looking for additional information that your suppliers may not be used to providing for you. So, but you really have to try and include it in your SLAs, in your contracts. Don't leave it to the last minute, because there'll be a temptation to say, well, I don't need to report on that till 2027. But it's 2026 is when you are actually kind of inadvertently reporting, because you're providing that import data to the customs authorities. So you need to know what that data is and what the cost of that is going to be to you.
So a lot of work required if you operate or import any of those particular items, I suppose, from non-EU countries.
Yeah, and it's going to extend downstream as well. So this is
Yeah,
only the beginning.
yeah. I know we do have an opportunity for Q&A at the end, but maybe to move it on slightly. And the other regulation you mentioned was the EU deforestation regulation. I know that's been pushed down the line slightly, but maybe to give us an overview on this and what practical steps business should be considering, and what businesses it might actually impact as well.
Yeah, so that was supposed to be introduced this year, but it's been pushed to next year. So it'll come into effect in December of this year. And the tendency, as with a lot of things, is to leave it really till the end, to the last moment, and then contact your suppliers. And as you can see, it's the same thing, contacting your suppliers, because what you're doing here is the EU is saying is preventing you from importing products which lead to deforestation or are on deforested land. So in order for you to obtain that information, again, you're going to need to go back to your suppliers, find out where the products are located. You need to get geographical geolocation information, for example, from where the products are. You're going to have to prepare a due diligence statement and lodge that with the EU. And again, customs are going to start connecting your due diligence statement with you as an importer, and they're going to check, are you completing this documentation? Are you validly tracking what you're importing into the EU? Have you checked with your supplier? Do you ensure that you're not importing from products which might lead to deforestation? So there's quite a lot of process, and you'll see there are kind of 5 steps for actually following and actually checking what is required. So understanding what the due diligence statement is at a base, the first level, understand what that statement is you're going to have to present. Again, check back with your suppliers. Are they ready for this? Can they give you the information? You have the obligation to provide the information. So if the suppliers can't, you need to be able to go and get that information. And it's that gateway into Europe that customs are being told to ensure that what comes into Europe is compliant from a European regulatory perspective in relation to the sustainability requirements.
Brilliant, thanks. I do. There is a question that's come through for CBAM, and maybe just a quick comment on this, Carol, and then we might move on. I'm conscious there's a bit to get through, but there's actually two, and they relate to the external assurance requirements and verification requirements. And I know we've had a number of discussions in relation to this, but maybe if you could give us a quick comment on that area, and then we might move on to the plastics piece, and then hand over to Jennifer.
Sure. So if you're importing, and if you're going to use your default values, then you don't need to verify that. That's produced by the EU Commission, but it is going to cost you. So one of the first thing we're kind of saying to companies is see how much you're going to be importing in a year, and then do a calculation. How much is this going to cost me if I use default values versus how much effectively will I save if I use actual values? Now, the difficulty with using actual values is you have to have those verified by an independent verifier. So you can't simply, as I said, just ask your supplier, they give you the information. They do have to be independently verified. There will be a portal opened up where companies, non-EU companies, can get registered and enter their data into a verified EU portal. So one of the questions to be asking your suppliers is, are they prepared for this? Are they going to put that information in kind of into the portal, so to speak? Or if not, how are they going to ensure that that the data being supplied to you is being authorized by a verified independent auditor? Because you, as the declarant and the importer, as with all things customs related, are the liable party.
Thanks, Carol. And I know you've a couple of statements in relation to some of the plastics import regulations that are coming in.
Yeah, and it's just very, very quickly. It's again, it's like we've got 2026 CBAM, 2027 essentially EUDR, 2028 the World Trade Organization produces a revamp of the tariff codes essentially every 4 years. And what they're saying is for 2028, and that's on the next slide, there's going to be new tariff codes being introduced for things like single-use plastic, plastic packaging. And again, this is to prevent these products being imported if they aren't allowed or if they're going to be subject to licensing. So, for example, single-use plastics are one that's a particular problem for the EU. A lot of those single-use plastics aren't allowed to be imported into Europe. But if they do and are being imported under certain conditions, that will need to be tracked. So these new tariff codes for the single use, the plastic packaging, the agricultural plastics, these will all be entered onto the import declaration so that the EU Commission can monitor what's coming into Europe.
So I suppose if we were to think about it, like the regulations you just discussed there are relate to products or materials that are being imported into the EU or into Ireland by organizations. If we were to move on slightly in terms of, if you take the plastics example and the circular economy in terms of the regulations that apply within the jurisdiction. Um, Moving on to Jennifer, maybe I know there's a lot happening in the circular economy space, so distinct to the customs and importing elements that Carol had been discussing. So, do you want to maybe give us an overview of some of the key Irish policy and legislation developments and that businesses should have on their radar?
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Mark. There's definitely a lot going on. So when we talk about circular economy, I suppose what are we talking about? We're really talking about a shift away from the traditional take, make, waste model that we have now, and towards a world where products and materials are kept in use for longer, waste is reduced, and the value is retained for as long as possible. So I think bringing it back to businesses on this call, particularly SMEs and scaling companies, this is really important because circular economy regulation, it's not just about policy issues anymore. It's now linked to things like market access, competitiveness, and customer expectations as well. So in Ireland, it's really been reinforced by a number of overlapping policies and frameworks, which you can see on the slide here. And in the interest of time, I won't deep dive into all of them because there's a lot I could say on them, but there are a few I'd like to highlight that I think are particularly relevant for companies on the call. First one in focus is Ireland's Circular Economy Strategy. So this is the latest one from 2026 to 2028. This is a really, really good initiative. It gives a clear national roadmap for how circularity is going to develop over the next few years in Ireland. And really it moves the conversation beyond waste and into areas like repair, reuse, product design, procurement, and business opportunity as well. It also signals that circularity is becoming part of mainstream enterprise and industrial policy, and it's not just sitting in an environmental policy silo. I think another really important one for this audience is green public procurement. Because if you're supplying into public bodies, local authorities, infrastructure, housing, and you may have already seen this in your day-to-day, but sustainability and circularity are increasingly influencing tender requirements. So it's really important to keep on top of it. And the Irish Green Public Procurement Strategy and Action Plan, this really means that buyers are being encouraged to not just look at cost, but also at life cycle impact, durability, repairability, and resource efficiency. So for many SMEs, it's not just about compliance, it can actually directly affect your ability to win new work. So a lot in it, but I think the key takeaway from this slide is that Ireland now has a strong policy and legislative framework that is steadily pushing businesses toward better product design, better data, less waste, and longer product life. So for most SMEs, the practical question is no longer, does it matter to us? It's more, how and where will this first show up in our business?
Brilliant. Thanks, Jennifer. And I suppose as we like listen to you speak there, like as we move from policy into what happens next on the ground, like what are the key developments businesses are most likely to feel first?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think people are kind of keen to understand the practical, tangible impacts that these regulations have on their business. Um, so yeah, this slide is really about what businesses are going to feel on the ground. So the first major development, which I'll point out that Carol alluded to a few moments ago, was the digital product passport, or DPPs. A lot of people have probably come across this before, but um, this is one of the clearest examples of where sustainability, product compliance, and digital capabilities are now converging. So, in simple terms, what is it for those of you who don't know? It's a digital record that's attached to a product, and it holds information like the materials, the origin, the repairability, environmental performance, and the end of life handling of that particular product. Under the EU Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, this will gradually become more of a reality, especially in product categories like textiles, furniture, tires, batteries, electronics, and construction related products. And this will affect many businesses indirectly first through things like customer questionnaires, retailer requirements, public procurement, and export expectations, going back to Carol's slides as well. So the next major development to talk about here is the traceability and green claims. So we're moving into a market it's no longer simply enough to say a product is sustainable or eco-friendly or better for the environment. Businesses are now increasingly expected to evidence those claims. So that's where tools like credible product data, third-party labels, and EPDs, or environmental product declarations, really become important, particularly in sectors like construction, manufacturing, and engineering. And the third and final area is the built environment. So this is also a really important sector, especially relevant for construction, housing, building products, and supply chain businesses. We're seeing circularity and sustainability increasingly reinforced through things like the energy performance of building framework, the circular built environment roadmap, and the wider energy efficiency expectations around that. So if you're in that ecosystem, the direction of travel is really clear. Materials, embodied carbon, product transparency, and life cycle performance are all becoming more commercially relevant. So there's probably a lot to digest in those two slides. It's a whistle-stop tour, but if I was to give 3 practical takeaways in terms of circular economy and sustainable products, they would be: firstly, circular economy is increasingly becoming a commercial and customer issue, not just an environmental one. Second, the real differentiator for many businesses will be the quality of their product and supply chain data. And the third, particularly for SMEs, is the key is not to do everything now. It's to start in a proportionate and practical way that's best for your business.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think yeah, a lot to digest there from both you and Carol. I think what it does tell me though, from a regulatory and impact standpoint, it's really impacting the real economy and how organizations, I suppose, deal with their upstream supply chain in terms of what they import, but also their customers as well, and how they engage with them, particularly from a circular economy perspective, which is distinct to what we're going to move on to next. And I don't think it will be a sustainability webinar without talking about disclosure requirements. And I always find that 2 weeks is a long time when it comes to sustainability reporting and assurance and what's happening globally. And Katie's going to bring us through the latest on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I know many of the organizations probably fall in the SME bracket, so we'll talk a bit about that, but also what's happening from a global perspective. So maybe Katie, if you could give us an overview starting with CSRD, that would be fantastic, and Omnibus.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Mark. So I'm just going to start with a brief overview of where we are post-Omnibus. So the Omnibus 1 package was agreed earlier this year. It significantly simplified sustainability regulations, specifically as CSRD and CSDDD directives. The package removed approximately 80% of companies from the scope of CSRD, so quite a big turnaround in a small period of time. You'll see the fully updated thresholds and timelines on this slide, but to focus in a bit, so if we look at the new Wave 2 reporters, the focus is on much larger companies now. So that would be organizations with over 1,000 employees and turnover exceeding 450 million. So for most of you, it's likely you're out of scope for mandatory reporting unless you're part of a large group or you're listed. In terms of timelines, so Wave 1 reporters already reporting for financial year 2024, they have to continue into financial year 2025. That is, unless they now fall outside the revised thresholds, and member states have 12 months to implement these changes nationally. And then for Wave 2 reporters who were previously due to start in 2026, so they'll now begin in 2028, which will be covering financial year 2027. So that might seem like a while away. However, preparation will certainly be key during the interim. There's also been changes to enterprise level and non-EU parent entity thresholds. There's not really much need to focus on this here, but if that's of interest to your organizations, the information will be available on the slides that we circulated, as Mark has said earlier. So what exactly does this mean for the majority of companies that are now out of scope? So according to the latest Sustainability Transformation Monitor, 75% of de-scoped companies are still planning to issue a voluntary sustainability report. That'll be in the next few years. This is because generally the consensus is that banks, investors, and business partners are not easing the pressure on their value chains. They're very much still requesting sustainability information, be that as part of their due diligence or their procurement processes, as well as to assist with their own reporting requirements generally. So stakeholder expectations definitely remain high. Even if you're out of scope, you most likely will still have requests for sustainability information, especially if you supply to larger in-scope companies. And these often come in the form of questionnaires, different questionnaires a lot of the time. So how do you really deal with that? And the best way for organizations to voluntarily report is quite a new development. So the voluntary sustainability reporting standards for SMEs. I understand the next webinar in this series, it will be focused on this specifically and comparing reports that have already been released across the EU. So I'll just provide kind of a brief overview of exactly what that entails at the moment. So the VSME was originally designed for SMEs, but it's since become increasingly relevant for out-of-scope organizations. Really, the key point here is that the Omnibus package introduced a value chain cap. And what this means is that organizations in scope for CSRD can only ask their value chain partners for information that's covered by the standard. So because of this, many of the out-of-scope organizations are adopting VSME as a kind of ready pack to respond to stakeholder and value chain requests. So it also has the benefit of setting up organizations for any future reporting requirements, as the European Commission has indicated that those will be based likely on the VSME. And also just to note, the VSME consists of 2 modules. So depending on where you are in your sustainability journey, there's a basic module and there's a comprehensive module, and you can adopt this based on what really suits your organization. So just to move on, so to expand on what Mark mentioned earlier, globally, the regulatory landscape remains dynamic as always. And so it's really important for organizations to map out which requirements may apply to their businesses globally and to develop a coherent approach. So some of the key updates globally would include the shifting landscape in the US. So sustainability reporting progress has really slowed in the US due to geopolitical shifts over the last few years. Several reporting initiatives paused or rolled back. However, waves are still definitely happening in other countries. China, for example, has adopted its corporate sustainable disclosure standard, which focuses on governance, strategy, risk and opportunity management, and metrics and targets. And then also in February, the UK published its sustainability reporting standards for consultation earlier this year, which has since been closed. So we can expect a final policy statement later this year. So definitely still moving along globally, just a few different headwinds in terms of geopolitics. So what does this mean for organizations and what practical steps should you be taking this year? So if you're a Wave 1 reporter, it's definitely the time to sit down with your auditors, review your second report and see where you can improve, but also see what you're doing well. Then for those of you in Wave 2, we'd really recommend doing a dry run for financial year 2027. So even though reporting isn't due until 2028, many organizations found their first year of reporting quite rushed. So definitely early data collection and auditor engagement would make it a much smoother process. And then for out-of-scope organizations, which I believe would be the majority of you, the main thing is to listen to your value chain and stakeholders. So there's a lot of benefits to voluntary reporting, as we've already discussed, but especially using the VSME. So for example, it'll reduce administrative burden as you can use one response for multiple requests, which I'm sure you've all seen, like you've received the multiple questionnaires from value chain partners, or at least you might have started receiving them. It also allows you to identify and address gaps in sustainability performance, and then it will position you as a market leader and a preferred partner. So I'd say really the key takeaway is that even for organizations not currently mandated to report, voluntary value chain driven is becoming kind of the new normal. So adopting frameworks like the SME can really provide strategic benefits and prepare you for future regulatory shifts.
Thanks, Katie. And I think the second bullet point on the right there as well, like in terms of organizations, like firstly, requests that are coming from finance providers and as wave two reporters begin to report more and ask for further requests down their value chain, but also understanding risks within your business. And I think being able to report on that will help you manage those risks, particularly from a climate related risk perspective, and what opportunities you might have in that regard as well, to thinking about some of the tailwinds that we presented earlier. So we tried to respond to some of the questions live as we could, and I think some of the questions we're going to take away as well. I know Kathleen, you had some questions for the team that came through separately and online that you might want to go through, and we've included some resources here for takeaway. And I think one of the questions, is it recorded, and will the slides be provided? And yes, they will be provided, and it is recorded, and I think it's going to be shared by Enterprise Ireland after. So
Yeah.
I think, Emma, you can stop sharing the slides now, and maybe as we move to Q&A, we can put back up if required. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks a million, Mark, and thanks to all the team at BDO. I mean, that was a whistle-top tour, I think, in terms of the state of play, in terms of changing regulations at the moment, and even for experts in this space, it's as we it's hard to keep up to date with how things are evolving. So I think it's really useful. So look, thanks for sharing. Sharing all that information with our audience today, and absolutely we'll be sharing the slides afterwards, and the recording will be available to watch back. So just one or two questions came in there, and I had one or two myself. So maybe Carol, initially for you, I know there's thresholds around CBAM, so I think those thresholds it's greater than 50 tons per annum, isn't it? So some of our clients will be, I suppose, below the threshold. So first of all, I suppose first step is to see, are they in scope or not in terms of those thresholds.
Exactly. It's 50 tons is the reporting requirement, except if it's electricity and I think hydrogen is the other one.
Yeah.
But so you have a 50-ton kind of baseline, so to speak.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Carol, then that it's going to move downstream, and what did you mean by that in terms of other products?
Yeah. So things like fasteners, for example, which are a big import into Ireland. So you're not just talking about the kind of the raw material element of, like, say, iron and steel type products. You're looking at what has been made from them. So also capturing the emissions data in relation to finished products. And I don't have the list in front of me of what those are going to be, but I certainly can add them onto the slide when circulating.
Yeah, no, look, that could be, I think, very interesting then for clients as well, in terms of, just having that, early indication of potentially, I suppose, what could be in scope. And I suppose just a reminder, if anyone has any other questions, please pop them into the chat. But there's just one question that has come through there, and it's just, if organizations could do one thing now, what would you suggest, I suppose, in terms of reducing that supply chain risk?
I would say reach out to your suppliers. Like, there's one and two things. It's your supply chain. You need to really focus in on what is your supply chain. What are the products you're buying? And that might seem obvious, but sometimes people don't absolutely know. So what are the products you're buying? Who you're buying them from? And get in touch with your suppliers to tell them that you're going to need to get data from them, whether it's deforestation data, whether it's CBAM data, whether it's the myriad of other regulations that are coming down the line. But set up those conversations with your suppliers, be really clear about what is going to be needed from them, and agree with them how that's going to be provided.
Well, that's great, and really good piece of advice. There's one question there, I think it might be for you, Carol, is just in relation to plastic and plastic toys and how they feature.
I was actually quickly looking at the World Customs Organization changes as over the last minute or two. So I don't see toys on it. It's balloon, if the product has been classified, I think it's in 9503 or so, like, yeah, 9503, and the changes to balloons, so they're going to be monitoring the balloons, but it doesn't seem like the actual toys. Most of the changes are coming through in chapter 39. But if the person who has that query wants to contact me in relation to the actual tariff code, I can do a double check for you.
That would be brilliant. Yeah, no, thanks very much. And it's just interesting how, yeah, the role that customs has now, I suppose. And I was talking to a client company recently, and literally in January, they were, they had imports being stopped, or they had to show whether they were under the threshold or not for CBAM in mid-January. So it was having an impact straight away.
We had a number of clients like that.
Yeah. So there's a question then, I think it's for Katie. So it's just around the Omnibus 1 directive. When was this expected to be transposed into Irish law?
Yeah, so from the publication of the Omnibus package into the official journal of the EU, member states have 12 months to transpose international law. So that would be until March of 2027 for CSRD. Based on precedents in Ireland, Ireland was one of the first countries to transpose CSRD, and we were very prompt last year in transposing the Stop the Clock directive. So we would expect it to be soon, though no date has actually been announced yet.
Yeah. And just there's a question there, I think it's for Jennifer. It's just in relation to the digital product passport. Just that it sounds, I suppose, quite technical. But what can businesses do now, I suppose, to prepare?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think sometimes people get frightened by the word digital product passport, not knowing what it is. But like really, if you break it down, it's really just for companies to really understand their own product, like what is the product made of, where the key inputs come from, and also things like, you have to think about, are you making claims that they're eco-friendly or green, etc. Can you back it up? And yeah, can you, I suppose, support those claims with credible data? I think the real challenge really isn't the passport or QR code or whatever medium is itself. It's really whether you have the underlying product and supplier data in a usable format, yes, but also really it's practically, do you understand the products itself?
Yeah.
So I think once you have that aligned, then you're halfway there.
And then in turn, I suppose, are you able to provide this information then to your supply chain partner, because they could be coming to you to look for it? So it's being able to help your supply chain partner provide that information. So we did host a webinar last year. It's available to watch back on the Enterprise Ireland website on eco design. So I'd recommend that. And one of our upcoming webinars is on the sustainability kind of transparent communications. So I think that's really relevant as well in terms of making claims. So there's just, let me see, there's one or two more questions coming in. So what role, if any, will external sustainability certifications play in complying with these regulations? I'll open that to the floor.
Yeah, maybe myself and Carol can tag team on that. I suppose it depends on the regulation. So as Carol mentioned, if you take the likes of CBAM, if you use anything other than your default values, that will require a certification of some sort and a verification of that particular certification as well. More broadly, if you're reporting under the likes of CSRD, as an example, if you're a Wave 1 or Wave 2 reporter, there's limited assurance that an auditor will have to perform on a mandatory basis as well. If you report under VSME, there is no mandatory assurance option as well. But bearing in mind as well, you are open to scrutiny from a market perspective as well. So it really depends on the nature of the regulation and some of the requirements there. I don't know, Carol, if you have anything to build on that.
The EU is going to start approving authorized verifiers for CBAM in September. So you will have to check if the person who is verifying the data is authorized and has that authorized certificate. Now, a lot of F-gas auditors will also go on to obtain that type of certification, but you will be an authorized verifier under the EU rules.
Yeah. And look, I suppose in terms of, you know, there's different sustainability standards and verification, I suppose, verifications that the companies can do. They will all help in terms of the end game, depending on which then you're reporting on, whether it be CBAM or others. So yeah, so that's great. There was just one other comment, kind of question around the Energy Efficiency Directive. Is this something that BDO comes across in terms of if you're auditing firms, in terms of there's a requirement for, you know, large companies, it'll be moving to kind of based on energy usage and energy consumption. Is this something that comes up in audits?
Yeah, it's something I'll take away, but my understanding with the that particular directive, it's primarily a technical engineering focused audit requirement that that SEAI effectively coordinates. So I think my rapid reaction is, or understanding is, it wouldn't be a firm like BDO
Yeah.
in the first instance, but it's something we'll take away and do a bit more research on.
Yeah, I think SAI are the
Yeah.
regulatory authority there. Yeah, so I don't see any more questions perhaps coming in there now. So look, I might just share my slides. I'm just going to run through just very quickly, as outlined earlier by Mark, some of our supports. So I'll just share my screen. Now, hopefully everyone can see my slide. So this is a one pager and it just gives an overview of the range of supports that Enterprise Ireland has to support its client companies.
Sorry, Kathleen, it hasn't come up yet.
Oh, sorry.
I can let you know if it comes up.
Can you see now?
It's come up now. Is this sustainability offer overview?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks a million. So yeah, so look, we've a range of different supports. Now we do have a webinar on green finance, but this slide here is obviously just showing Enterprise Ireland supports. And these are a range of supports to support companies wherever they are on their sustainability journey, whether they're starting out on their sustainability journey or whether they're well, you know, on the way and looking at doing R&D or actually, you know, implementing and deploying low carbon production processes and technology. So at the very earliest stage, we have Sustainability Kickstarter workshops, which are 3-hour online workshops where companies can develop a sustainability plan. We have a Sustainability Leaders program, which is more in-depth. It's in partnership with Skillnet. So it's 6 workshops, typically over 8 to 10 weeks for companies to develop a sustainability charter. And these are free programs available to Enterprise Ireland client companies, particularly SMEs. In terms of the grant supports then, so we have a range of grant supports to help companies access advice, whether that be through the Climate Action Voucher or a Green Start, to build capabilities, and that can be around carbon footprinting, your data management, how to engage with your supply chain, how to align to you know, international standards, whether that's ISO 14001 or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So we don't support compliance, but we can support companies build their internal capabilities and access advice. Then we have supports around metering and tracking. So, you know, that can be energy, water, steam. So there's a 50% grant there for companies to install meters. And we've supports to help companies really develop that kind of strategic, you know, roadmap for decarbonisation, for becoming more circular, but kind of get that technical advice, that expert consultancy advice to help develop that roadmap. And we've a range of supports then under R&D, so that can range from an innovation voucher right up to a really large R&D grant to develop more sustainable products, processes and services. And then we have our capital supports to really, you know, deploy those low carbon production processes and technologies. So the types of projects that we're supporting, and we do support companies from high potential startups to SMEs to large companies, and we're supporting companies that are, you know, professional services companies and manufacturing companies. But the types of activities, I suppose, will vary according to the company's sector and size. So for large companies, and if it's a professional services organisation, just as an example, you know, some of those are still at kind of the early stages of you know, developing their sustainability plan or their decarbonisation plan, embedding really good environmental best practice management systems, so aligned to ISO 14001, training their employees, carbon footprinting, in terms of their organization, developing a carbon reduction roadmap, and really engaging then with their supply chain. So supply chain comes up over and over again with all companies, because that's where most of the impacts lie. But for manufacturing companies, and particularly those that are, high energy users, large water consumers, they're looking at water stewardship, environmental management systems, perhaps a carbon footprint and life cycle assessment of their product. And that links back to, some of the circular economy and eco design regulations. So we can support companies on how to do an LCA, how to calculate the carbon footprint of their product. And we see a lot of companies now looking at packaging, which come up earlier, logistics, meters, as mentioned earlier, with the capital support there for meters, and then our larger capital supports. So SMEs are looking at similar activities, but if the resource use doesn't justify it, or if their customers are looking for them to implement maybe a management system, and they're a small SME, they could be looking at having, a sustainability policy or policies in place. But they're also looking at, same types of activities, developing a sustainability plan, understanding the carbon footprint of their organization, and developing a plan to reduce, and also looking at sustainable procurement. And then with high potential startups, again, companies are developing a plan. So these are companies that are starting out with that green lens and really, developing the policies at a very early stage. So as they grow and scale, that they're doing it so in a green and sustainable manner. So look, that's just the range of activities that we're supporting under, whether it's the training and advisory supports, or whether it's the capital supports. So I'm just going to include, if I have a slide here, just to show you our next webinars that are coming up. So if you haven't had a chance to have a look, please do, and we welcome you to register for any of these if they're of interest. And just look, thanks everyone, in particular, I suppose, to our panelists today and to BDO for sharing all that information. But thank you, our attendees, I suppose, as well. And it's great to see such big numbers attending and registering for today's event. So look, hopefully you'll be able to join some of our future webinars, and hopefully you found some of the information here useful for you and for your organisation. But for more information on the Enterprise Ireland supports, or to watch back any of the webinars, register for any of the upcoming webinars, please visit our Sustainability Supports webpage. And if you want to talk to anyone about the supports, you can contact your client advisor, or you can email green@enterprise-ireland.com, and we'll arrange a call then with one of our, with myself, with Ankush, who is here on the call supporting, or with one of the sustainability team. So look, thanks everyone for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks very much. Bye.